My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 4:47 in the afternoon, a small square notification from a local discovery app I barely remembered installing. And when I glanced at it, my coffee cup slipped an inch in my hand because the thumbnail showed a woman with my exact face laughing into a camera at Birchwood Cafe, the little coffee shop 5 minutes from my house, wearing the mustard yellow corduroy jacket I had buried with my sister 11 months ago. For a moment, I told myself it was a filter, some strange AI trick, a stranger who happened to look like us, because grief plays tricks and I had spent almost a year convincing myself I was healing. Then the woman on the screen turned her head to laugh at something off camera and touched the small mole just below her left ear. The same mole I had, the same mole my twin sister Odell had, in the exact same spot, because we were identical down to the millimeter, and no filter in the world fakes a birthmark that precisely. I stood frozen in my kitchen in Asheville, North Carolina, my hands shaking so badly that my coffee spilled over the rim and burned a thin line across my knuckles, and I did not even feel it, because 11 months earlier my husband had knelt beside a closed casket and sobbed into my shoulder while a priest read my sister's name off a program. And now she was 5 minutes away, alive, laughing, wearing her own funeral jacket like a costume. I am Odette Calloway. I am 36 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon in October, I believed the two hardest things I had ever survived were burying my father at 19 and burying my twin sister at 35. I did not know yet that the second one had never actually happened, and that the man I had shared a bed with for 9 years had built an entire funeral out of a lie, so complete it had a coffin, a eulogy, and a folded American flag from a military service record that, I would later learn, had been forged. I want to tell you everything, from the beginning, because the story does not start with the live stream. It starts 11 months earlier with a phone call from Spain that I answered on a Sunday morning, while flour still coated my hands from making pancakes for my husband. My sister Odell and I were born 4 minutes apart in a hospital in Charlotte, and for most of our lives that 4 minutes was the only meaningful difference anyone could find between us. We finished each other's sentences. We felt each other's pain in strange physical ways. Once in 6th grade, I broke my wrist on the monkey bars, and Odell, 3 miles away at a friend's house, said her wrist ached the exact same minute. Our mother used to call us one soul folded into two bodies. And even after Odell's life went sideways in her late 20s, after the man she loved left her with debt she did not create, after the pills that started as pain management and became something else, after 2 stints in a recovery facility in Charleston, I never once let go of her hand. I paid for the second stay in recovery myself, quietly, without telling my husband the full amount, because Desmond had opinions about what he called enabling, and I had learned early in our marriage that some kindnesses were easier to give in silence than to defend out loud. Desmond Cade and I met at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital when I was 26. He was already the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice, tall, composed, the sort of charm that made older women trust him with their retirement accounts. Which was fitting, because Desmond built his career managing exactly that: wealth management, estate planning, the quiet architecture of other people's futures, and I fell for him the way you fall for a well-built house, admiring the structure before you ever ask who poured the foundation. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Asheville. Odell was my maid of honor, and in her toast she said something I never forgot. She said, "Watch this one, Odette. He talks like a man who has already decided how the story ends," and everyone laughed because it sounded like a joke, but Odell rarely joked without meaning half of it. For the first several years our marriage looked, from the outside and mostly from the inside too, like a success story. Desmond's client list grew, our house grew, our savings grew, and Odell's struggles became the one thread of chaos in an otherwise tidy life. A thread Desmond treated the way he treated every messy variable, as something to be managed, contained, and eventually resolved. 18 months before the funeral, Odell called me late one night, her voice thin and scared in a way I had not heard since our father's diagnosis. She said she had gotten involved with people in Charlotte who were not the kind of people you simply stopped owing money to. She would not tell me the full story, only that she needed to leave the state for a while, and that a friend had offered her a fresh start doing seasonal hospitality work on the coast of Spain. in a small town outside Malaga. Desmond, when I told him, was unusually supportive. He offered to help arrange her travel, said he had a contact who handled relocation logistics for clients moving assets overseas, and at the time I remember feeling a rush of gratitude so large it embarrassed me. I remember thinking, I married a good man, a man who protects the people I love even when it costs him nothing to walk away instead. I know now that gratitude was the first brick in the wall he was building around me. Oda left for Spain in March, and for the first 4 months she called every week, her voice getting steadier, sun in her laugh. She sent photographs of a whitewashed apartment with blue shutters, of orange trees, of a life slowly reassembling itself in a language she was only beginning to learn. And I let myself believe the nightmare of the last several years was finally behind her, behind us. Then in July the calls became less frequent. Desmond told me Odell had mentioned to him, during a call I supposedly missed, that she felt embarrassed about how little progress she had made and needed space to sort herself out without an audience. And because that sounded exactly like something Odell might say in one of her low moods, I did not question it. I gave her the space. I told myself twins do not need constant contact to remain connected. In September, Desmond came home from a work trip to Madrid, a trip I remember finding strange only in hindsight because his firm had no meaningful presence in Spain, and told me he had made time to visit Odell, that she looked wonderful, tan, and clear-eyed, and that she had asked him not to tell me the visit happened because she wanted to surprise me herself when she came home for the holidays. I believed him completely, because why would I not? He was my husband, and Odell's secrecy fit the pattern of a woman rebuilding her pride one careful step at a time. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in October, my phone rang while I stood at the stove making pancakes, and Desmond's face changed before he even said a word. He set down his coffee, walked toward me with the particular slowness of a man delivering news he has rehearsed, and said the words that broke the floor out from under my life. There had been an accident on a coastal road outside Malaga. A rental car, a cliffside curve, no other vehicle involved, and my sister, my Odell, was gone. I do not remember screaming, though Desmond later told me I did. I remember the smell of burning pancake batter and the sound of my own knees hitting the kitchen tile. And I remember Desmond's arms around me, solid and warm, saying the words I clung to for the next 11 months. "I've got you, Odette. I will handle everything. You do not have to do this alone." He handled everything, that was true. He handled the international paperwork, the coordination with a funeral home in Charlotte that specialized in repatriating remains, the death certificate translated from Spanish, the cremation authorization, all of it moving through channels I never saw and never thought to ask to see, because grief does not audit paperwork, grief simply drowns. The funeral was held on a gray afternoon in late October at a small chapel outside Asheville, and I remember almost nothing of it except fragments. The closed urn on a table dressed in white lilies, because Odell once said she wanted lilies, not roses. Desmond's hand gripping mine so hard my fingers went numb. His voice cracking during a eulogy he insisted on giving himself even though I offered to write something. And the moment he knelt in front of the small table holding the urn and wept. Publicly, completely, the kind of weeping that made 2 of Odell's old sponsor friends from recovery cross the room to comfort him. Everyone told me afterward how lucky I was to have a husband who grieved so openly, who loved my sister as if she were his own, and I nodded and thanked them, because I believed it too. He handed me the urn himself at the end of the service, both hands like something sacred, and said, "She is home now, Odette," and I held that urn against my chest the entire drive home and slept with it on the nightstand for the first 3 weeks. And I did not know, could not have known, that the ashes inside belonged to no one at all, that a cooperative funeral director 2 states away had filled it with cremated wood ash for a fee that would later appear, disguised as a consulting invoice. In Desmond's business account. For 11 months I grieved a sister who was alive. I visited her grave marker every Sunday. I wrote her letters I never sent. I kept her number saved in my phone even though it rang through to nothing. And Desmond watched all of it, comforted all of it, and never once flinched. Which brings me back to that Tuesday afternoon in October, 1 year almost to the week after the funeral, Standy. NG in my kitchen, with a burn rising on my knuckles, and my dead sister, laughing at me from a 5-minute-old live stream at a cafe. I had walked past 1,000 times. I did not call Desmond. Some instinct older than logic told me not to. Instead, I grabbed my keys, left my coffee cup shattered on the floor where I had dropped it, and drove to Birchwood Cafe with my hands so unsteady I nearly ran a stop sign on Merriman Avenue. I parked across the street and sat in my car for what felt like an hour but was probably 90 seconds, watching through the window as a woman who wore my face, my sister's face, our face, sat at a corner table with a laptop open, a coffee cooling beside her, wearing a mustard corduroy jacket that had a small tear near the left cuff. A tear I recognized instantly because I was the one who had accidentally caught it on a nail the week before we buried it with her. I got out of the car, my legs barely holding, and walked toward the cafe door, and through the glass Odell looked up, and for one full second neither of us moved. Twin recognition is a strange animal thing, faster than thought, and I watched her face cycle through shock, fear, and something that looked almost like relief before she stood so fast her chair scraped backward, and she said my name. I did not hug her, I could not, my body would not let me. I stood in the doorway of a cafe with strangers glancing up from their laptops, and I said the only sentence that came to me, "You let me bury you." Odell's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. She reached toward me and I stepped back, and she said, "Odette, please, it is not what you think." And I laughed, a horrible sound I did not recognize as my own voice, because that is the exact sentence Desmond had once said to a client's wife who caught him overstating a portfolio return. It was not what you think. It was always not what I thought. That seemed to be the family motto now. We ended up in her car, not mine, because I could not trust myself to drive, and she told me the truth in pieces, stopping every few minutes to check that I was still listening, still breathing, still there. She told me that 8 months before the funeral, Desmond had reached out to her directly, using an encrypted messaging app, at first offering to help pay off the debt that had chased her to Spain in the first place. A debt she later learned he had quietly inflated in her mind through months of manufactured urgency. Texts from unknown numbers that were never truly unknown at all. And once she was frightened enough, desperate enough, he made his real offer. There was a life insurance policy, I learned, one Desmond had taken out on Odell 3 years earlier under a rider connected to a family trust he managed, listing himself and me as joint beneficiaries in the event of her death. A policy Odell did not fully understand existed because Desmond had framed it to her, gently, as a safety net for her recovery years, something responsible families do for a struggling member. And it had quietly appreciated to just over $2 million. Desmond told Odell that if she disappeared, truly disappeared, faked a death clean enough to survive scrutiny, they could split the payout. She could finally be free of the debt collectors who had followed her even to Europe, free of a name and a history that had trapped her for a decade, and start over completely. A new identity, a new country, a new life. And he promised her it would only take 1 year before he quietly transferred her share, and she could vanish for good, untraceable, safe. What he did not tell her, what she only pieced together slowly over the months that followed, was that he had also been sleeping with her, using visits to Spain disguised as work trips, using her isolation and her fear and her love for me as leverage, telling her I was the one who suggested it, telling me nothing at all, playing both twins against a truth neither of us held complete. I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper, why she let me grieve her for 11 months, why she let me kneel at a fake grave every Sunday. And she started crying in a way that made her look exactly like she had at 19, right after our father died, and she said, because he told me you already knew, Odette, he told me you agreed to it, that it was the only way to save both of us. And I believed him because you were the one thing in this world I trusted completely, and he used that. I sat in that car in a cafe parking lot in Asheville and felt something inside me that had been slowly cracking for 11 months finally break all the way open. Not sadness, not yet, something colder, something that steadied my hands instead of shaking them. I asked her one more question before I got out of that car. I asked her if she was still in contact with him, and she nodded and told me he had flown into Charlotte 3 days earlier under a different name on his passport, staying at a rental property neither of us knew he owned, because the insurance payout had finally cleared into an offshore account 2 weeks ago, and he had come to finalize the last step, giving Odell her portion in cash and a new set of documents before she vanished for good. Documents from a contact of his, the same contact, I would later learn, who had helped forge the Spanish death certificate in the first place. She had come to the cafe that afternoon, she told me, sobbing, because she could not go through with it, because sitting in that rented house with a new name waiting for her on a table like a costume she was supposed to wear for the rest of her life, she thought of me kneeling at a headstone with nothing under it. And she broke. She needed 1 hour of feeling like herself. So she wore the only piece of clothing Desmond had let her keep, the jacket. And she went live on an app neither of us had used in years out of some desperate unconscious need to be seen, to be real, one more time before disappearing forever. I do not think Odell understood, until she watched my face in that parking lot, that the plan had never truly protected her either, that a man capable of building a funeral out of nothing was not a man who intended to hand $2 million to a woman who could, at any moment, decide to come back from the dead. I left her sitting in that car, told her not to go back to the rental house, not to contact Desmond, and drove straight to the office of an attorney named Priscilla Voss, a sharp, unhurried woman who had handled my father's estate years earlier and who listened to my entire story without interrupting once, her pen moving faster and faster across a legal pad as I spoke. Priscilla told me something that steadied me more than anything else could have that day. She said, "Odette, what you are describing is not simply a betrayal, it is insurance fraud, it is likely wire fraud, it is possible forgery of government documents. And if any of it touches interstate or international lines, which it clearly does, this becomes a federal matter, not just a divorce." We spent the next 6 hours in her office, Odell eventually joining us, shaking, terrified, but talking, giving names, dates, screenshots of the encrypted messages she had foolishly kept because some instinct in her, the same instinct that made her go live at that cafe, had refused to let her destroy the one thing that proved she was telling the truth. By nightfall, Priscilla had already contacted a former colleague who now worked in the fraud division of the insurance carrier itself. And by the next morning, a claims investigator named Harlan Boyce was on a call with us, his voice careful and clipped in the way of a man who had seen every version of this scheme, except perhaps this exact one, twin sisters, a staged death, an affair layered underneath the fraud like sediment under a lake. I did not go home that night. I stayed at Priscilla's recommendation in a hotel downtown, my phone switched off, because within hours Desmond had realized Odell was not answering him, had realized something was wrong, and had begun calling me, first once, then constantly, 37 missed calls by midnight, each one a small, violent reminder of how easily he had once made panic look like love. 2 days later, with Harlan Boyce's investigators quietly building a paper trail behind the scenes, and with a private security consultant Priscilla hired watching the rental property Desmond was staying in, I finally agreed to see him, not alone, in Priscilla's conference room, with a recorder running and my attorney seated beside me like a wall I could finally lean on instead of building myself. Desmond walked in looking thinner than I remembered, the composure that had defined him for 9 years fraying visibly at the edges, and when he saw me, his face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It looked afraid. "Odette," he started, "you have to understand the position I was in," and I let him talk. Priscilla had told me to let him talk, because every sentence a guilty man says without a script is a sentence that can be used against him later. He told a story that shifted every few minutes, first insisting the insurance policy was legitimate and Odell's disappearance was her own choice for her own protection from her old debts, then insisting he had only meant to help her. Then, when I mentioned the offshore account Harlan's team had already flagged, insisting that account was for both of us, that he had planned to tell me everything once the money cleared, that this had all been, in his words, a gift I simply was not ready to understand yet. I asked him the same question I had asked Odell in that parking lot, why he let me grieve for 11 months, why he knelt at an empty urn and wept in front of 200 in front of everyone who mattered to us and performed a sorrow he never felt, and for the first time since I had known him, Desmond. Cade had no answer ready. He simply looked at the table and said, "I did not think you would survive it if I gave you a smaller lie, so I gave you the whole thing." That sentence told me more about the last 9 years of my marriage than anything else he could have said. He had never once, not in the moment I fell for his composure at that gala, Not in the moment he promised to handle everything at my sister's funeral, actually asked what I could survive. He had simply decided, on my behalf, over and over again, and called it love. I told him then, calmly, the same calm I had learned to use like armor over the previous 48 hours, that the investigation was already underway, that the insurance carrier had frozen the offshore account that morning, that federal wire fraud statutes did not care how eloquently a man explained his intentions, and that Odell had already given a full statement. He stood up so fast his chair toppled backward, and for one moment I saw the version of him I imagine his clients never got to see, the version underneath the composed house I had once admired, hollow, panicked, furious that the story was ending in a way he had not written. He was arrested 11 days later at a private airfield outside Charlotte, attempting to board a chartered flight with a passport under a name that matched no birth certificate anywhere in the country. And the same forensic patients Priscilla and Harlan Boyce's team had applied to my case, unraveled, over the following months. A far larger scheme than even I had imagined. 3 other clients whose estate documents bore signatures that upon closer inspection were never truly theirs. Small siphoned amounts hidden inside the kind of paperwork that only a trusted advisor gets close enough to touch. Odell was not charged. In the end, the prosecutors and Harlan's investigators agreed that the evidence showed a woman manipulated by fear, debt, and a decade of vulnerability that Desmond had studied and exploited with the same careful patience he applied to every portfolio he managed. Though she did have to formally reverse the fraudulent death certificate, a process that took months and left her, for a strange stretch of time, legally undead in the eyes of the state of North Carolina. A woman with no valid identification, no bank account, no driver's license. A ghost who had to prove, document by document, that she had never actually died. I helped her rebuild that identity the same way I had helped her rebuild her life a decade earlier, patiently, without keeping score. Because whatever anger I carried toward her for going along with the plan was smaller, in the end, than the anger I carried for the man who built the plan and handed her no real choice at all. We are, my sister and I, still repairing something that may never fully repair. There are nights she calls me crying, apologizing again for a decision she made out of fear rather than malice. And I remind her, the way I remind myself, that the person who orchestrated our entire shared nightmare is the one wearing an ankle monitor in a rented apartment in Charlotte awaiting federal sentencing, not her. The insurance carrier, once the fraud was confirmed, pursued its own civil recovery against Desmond directly. And because our marital assets were far more entangled with his business dealings than I had ever realized, the divorce proceedings that followed were less a negotiation than an excavation. Priscilla and a forensic accountant spent months tracing money through accounts I never knew existed, accounts funded partly by our joint savings, partly by client funds he had quietly borrowed against and never fully returned. By the time the divorce was finalized, I walked away with the house, my father's original investments that Desmond had never managed to fully absorb into his own name, and something I valued more than any of it, full legal clarity. A paper trail so exhaustive that not one person in Asheville who once admired Desmond Cade's composure could ever again mistake it for integrity. Desmond pled guilty eventually to wire fraud, identity document forgery, and insurance fraud, avoiding a trial that would have exposed even more of his other clients' compromised accounts, and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, a number that felt, on the day I heard it read aloud in a Charlotte courtroom, both enormous and strangely small compared to the years he had quietly stolen from Odell and from me. Odell testified only once, in a closed hearing regarding restitution, and I sat beside her the entire time, holding her hand the way I had held it through every hospital hallway, every recovery meeting, every hard year of our lives. Because whatever mistakes she made under duress, she was still the other half of the 4 minutes that made us who we are, and I was not about to let her face the last chapter of this alone the way I had faced the funeral alone 11 months earlier. People at times ask me now, at dinners, at the grief support group I still occasionally attend even though my grief turned out to have a pulse, how I managed to hold myself together through discovering that both the man I married and the sister I buried had built an entire year of my life out of a lie. And I tell them honestly, I did not hold together. I simply refused to let the two people who had already taken so much also take whatever was left of who I actually was. Oda lives 20 minutes from me now, in a small rental with actual, verified, unforged paperwork, working at a plant nursery outside town, slowly building the ordinary quiet life that Spain and Desmond and a $2 million temptation had once promised her and never delivered. We do not talk about that October very often. Some silences are not avoidance. They are simply the space two people need to keep standing next to each other without collapsing under the weight of what happened. But every few months, usually around dusk, she will show up at my door wearing that same mustard corduroy jacket, the tear near the cuff mended now with careful stitching I did myself late one night when I could not sleep. And we will sit on my back porch and watch the mountains go dark and not say anything at all, and somehow that has become its own kind of healing. As for me, I sold the house in the spring, the one with the kitchen where I dropped a coffee cup and where flour once covered my hands on the last ordinary Sunday morning I would ever have, and I bought a smaller place closer to town, closer to Odell, with a kitchen window that faces east instead of west. Because I did not want to start my mornings staring at the same view I once shared with a man who let me kneel at an empty urn and call it grief. Peace, I have learned, does not arrive the moment justice does. Justice arrived in a courtroom, in a 7-year sentence, in a frozen offshore account, and a formal apology from an insurance company that admitted its own underwriting process should have caught the irregularities sooner. But peace arrived much later and much quieter. It arrived the first morning I woke up in my new house and realized I had not once, not for a single second, wondered what Desmond Cade needed me to believe. I do not know if I will ever fully trust the instinct that once told me a well-built house does not need you to ask who poured the foundation. But I know this much now: I will never again mistake composure for honesty, and I will never again let anyone, however much I love them, decide on my behalf what grief I am strong enough to survive. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Odette's place? Would you have forgiven your sister the way she did? Or would that betrayal have been the one thing too heavy to carry forward? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about betrayal, hidden truths, and the long road back to peace, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.